Lauren, I'm one of the pastors here at Kew. It's good to be with you tonight. Just got a couple of ministry team announcements to make. First of all, we've got a few little staffing updates to bring you up to speed on. He already kind of announced himself during announcements, but Sabian, if you didn't catch it before, has started as a ministry intern this year at Kew, which is wonderful news. So we're really excited to have Sabo on board. He's going to be coordinating our Hub Night series. He's going to be running new events called Catalyst later in the year as well, and just being an overall valuable presence in the team. So we're really excited to have him start with us. Other exciting bit of news is we have another new member of the ministry team officially starting tomorrow, and that is Maddie Westbrook, who is coming on board. Yeah, round of applause for Maddie. Maddie is coming on board as our pastoral worker. So just a bit of context, I think most of you know, but I will be heading off on maternity leave in the middle of the year. We're already working ahead to what that looks like in terms of covering different ministry portfolios in my absence. And Maddie is going to be stepping into overseeing our Connect group ministry, which is fantastic. She's also going to be doing some more sort of broader chaplaincy, pastoral care work, especially with our night church congregation with the young adults, sort of pastoral care, also helping to coordinate social events for the young adults as well. She's such a fantastic asset to have on the team. We're really excited to have her on board and so excited that she can start so soon as well. So that's officially starting tomorrow. So Maddie, we're really excited to have you on board. Please be praying for Maddie, for Sabo, for our ministry team as we settle into the year. It is a big and exciting year at Kew Baptist Church. All right, as we get underway this evening, I want to start with a little reflective exercise, some questions for you to consider. These are just for you to think about yourself. So introverts, you don't have to panic. I'm not going to make you talk to the people around you. Just think in your own time. If you're a journaler, maybe you want to write something down. I'll leave that up to you. But the questions are up on the screen. I want you to consider, when have you most tangibly felt or known God's presence in your life? And what characterized that experience for you? So when have you most tangibly felt or known God's presence in your life, and what characterized that experience for you? In other words, what set it apart from all the other moments in your life? What defined or distinguished that experience for you? I recognize that there may be some of you listening today who perhaps don't feel as though you've ever had that personal experience of God's presence in your life. That's okay. If that's the case for you, I still encourage you to consider these questions, but perhaps you can do it through the framework of your expectations or your preconceptions. For example, when do you expect that one might more tangibly feel or know God's presence? When or in what context do you sort of expect that that could happen? What do you expect that might look or feel like? Now, in terms of feeling or knowing God's presence as you reflect on that, maybe for some of you, it's when you're at church and when you're lifting your voices, worship in song. Maybe it's when you're praying, reading the scriptures. For other people, it might be when you're out in nature and enjoying creation, or when you're in community and amongst people. There's no one answer. There's no right or wrong answers. This is just for you to personally reflect for yourself. When have you most tangibly felt or known God's presence? And as you consider what characterized that experience for you, maybe there was a sense of reverence, awe, wonder. Maybe there was just an overwhelming sense of peace or comfort. Maybe you got goosebumps or tingles or some other kind of physical manifestation. Again, there's no one answer, no right or wrong answers. I just really want you to focus in on your experience for a moment, to reflect on your own relationship with the presence of God, whether that's something you have experienced or perhaps you're still hoping to experience. And I've got one final question. What has been your experience of God's presence in wilderness seasons? When you're traversing the valleys, the deserts of life, do you associate the wilderness as a time of intimacy with God? Or is it a time of distance from God, more like spiritual dryness? How have you personally known God's presence in the wilderness? I encourage you to keep those thoughts and reflections in the back of your mind as we get into the message tonight. We are, as Kieran said, in the final week of our Exodus series, Faith in the wilderness. And if you haven't guessed it already, our focus today is on the theme of the presence of God. Now, if you were here last week, you would have heard a bit about God's presence already as we had Pastor Mark teaching on the tabernacle. Remember all those elaborate, extravagant plans that are handed down in Exodus as God directs Moses to create this place for God to dwell among his people, this glorified tent, as Pastor Mark called it. It's this incredible representation of God's presence with his people. It's hugely significant. And all of that is laid out for us in Exodus chapters 25 through to 31. Now, the construction and the establishment of the tabernacle then takes place across Exodus chapters 35 to 40, which is where the book then finishes. And if you're paying attention to the numbers there, you might realize that we're missing some chapters. There's this gap in between God giving his directions for the tabernacle and the tabernacle actually being established. And what happens in this gap is critical. And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at two stories from chapters 32 and 33, and really two contrasting stories about the presence of God, and especially how we respond to the presence of God in the wilderness. So let me just set up the narrative a little before we dive headlong into chapter 32. What we've seen in the preceding chapters has been God establishing his covenant with his people. So God's handed down the 10 Commandments, he set the other laws before them, and if you remember, it's quite a spectacular narrative to behold. You know, there's thunder, there's a lightning, there's people trembling with fear at the glory of God. In chapter 24, Moses reads out the book of the covenant to the people. They respond in unison, "We will do everything the Lord has said, we will obey." And then we get this incredible reference in verses 9 to 11 where it says, "Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, who were the sons of Aaron, and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky. But God did not raise his hand against these leaders of the Israelites. They saw God and they ate and drank." What a sentence. They saw God. They saw God. Isn't that phenomenal? And then even for the people who weren't included in that special 70 elders, it says in verse 17 that to the Israelites, so the rest of the people, the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on the top of a mountain. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't think that's something we see every day. And if you think back to those reflective questions at the start about personally experiencing the presence of God, I mean, these people would have had some off-the-charts responses, right? Like, when have you most tangibly known the presence of God? Well, I once saw this consuming fire on the top of a mountain. How about you? Well, for me, it was probably that time I saw God. I saw God. I mean, it's genuinely breathtaking stuff. It's so breathtaking that it makes what happens next in chapter 32 utterly heartbreaking. And we're going to read that now from verses 1 to 10. It says, "When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, 'Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him.' Aaron answered them, 'Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing and bring them to me.' So all the people took off their earrings and brought them to Aaron. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.' When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, 'Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord.' So the next day, the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it and have said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." I have seen these people, the Lord said to Moses, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation. It's heavy stuff. It's devastating. Even sickening, really. I mean, how could they fall so far, so fast? And off the back of such a profound, miraculous, supernatural revelation of God's presence. You know, how did we go from those heavenly visions to this debaucherous disobedience? You know, to go from the thunder and the lightning and the consuming fire on the mountaintop to them instead worshipping a statue they made from their own jewelry. It just doesn't compute. It's unfathomable, right? But you know what I find most confronting about this story is recognizing how those same inclinations can exist in our hearts today. Like, it's so easy to judge and it's so easy to throw stones at the Israelites, but I wonder what our track record is like. Because remember, the Israelites went off the rails because Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, so they weren't hearing from God. I wonder, how do we respond when God seems absent in our lives? You know, when God is not showing up in the ways that we want or expect, when he's not acting in accordance with our terms. You know, we might not literally build a golden calf in the backyard, but you know, as Pastor Mark said the other week, we will always be worshiping something, always giving our affection, our trust, our devotion to something. So in those times where it feels like we're not hearing from God in the ways that we want, how easily can we turn away from him and put our trust in other things? We start trusting more in ourselves, maybe our bank balance, our material possessions. How easily can we give our attention and our affection to other things? If it's just a benign scrolling on the phone, just a little bit more, seeking the affirmation and validation of other people, distracting ourselves with entertainment, filling ourselves up with worldly comforts. You know, I think the danger for us in getting outraged at the golden calf story is that we can let ourselves off the hook. And we kind of turn into a version of the Pharisee praying in Luke chapter 18. And we're saying, I thank you, God, that I'm not like those Israelites. I've never made a golden calf. I've never bowed down to a statue. But in so doing, we can overlook the lures of idolatry in our own lives, which are perhaps even more dangerous because of their subtlety, because of how they can take root without us fully realizing. Those other places where we might be putting our trust or giving our affection outside of God, especially when we're feeling as though God is absent. So we need to be careful to approach this story with humility, asking God to search our own hearts and to convict us of any spaces which are not completely turned towards him. There's one more detail I want to pick up on this story before we move into chapter 33, and that's what I would say is the disconnect between the people's perception of what God is doing and the reality of what God is doing. So the people turn away from God because Moses was up on the mountain for such a long time and they just gave up on him, basically. They're like, well, he's not coming back. Moses is how we hear from God. We're not hearing from God, so we'll just go to plan B. We'll make our own gods ourselves. But do you remember why Moses was up on the mountain for such a long time? It's what we covered last week in chapters 25 to 31. God was giving Moses these detailed, elaborate instructions for the tabernacle. Are you seeing the irony here? They turned away from God because they felt like God was absent. But it was in that very perceived absence that God was actually working to make himself more present. He was making extravagant, groundbreaking plans to dwell among his people in the tabernacle. I was trying to think of a human equivalent as an illustration, and I'll admit it's a bit of a crude analogy, but I thought it's a little bit like if you were in a long-distance relationship with someone and you try to call your partner on the phone and they don't answer your phone call. And when they don't answer your call, you give up on them and you go off and you cheat on them with someone else. And then you learn the reason they didn't answer that call was because they were on a plane flying all the way to see you in person. What you perceived as their absence was actually them working in unseen ways to become even more present. There are seasons of our lives where God can feel absent, when we're not hearing from him in the ways or the timing that we want. And that can be so hard. Genuinely, I know that firsthand, and I don't want to sugarcoat it. At the same time, when we take a close look at the revelation of God's character throughout Scripture, what we learn is that God is always moving, even in the unseen. And he is always working for the greatest good. And so those times of perceived absence can actually be part of a bigger picture plan of God working to draw us even closer into his presence. Because as Pastor Mark reminded us last week, our God is a God who moves towards us. The question is how we will respond in those wilderness seasons. Will we turn away and give up like the Israelites with the golden calf? Or will we, somewhat against the odds, continue to press in and to boldly seek the glorious presence of God? And that really leads us into the next story in chapter 33, this remarkable encounter of Moses with the glory of God. And just to briefly bridge the gap between the two stories, because where we left off in chapter 32 was that God was ready to wipe out the Israelites for their idolatry. His anger was burning against them. What follows in that chapter is the most phenomenal intercessory prayer as Moses goes into bat for his people, and he gets God to change his mind, which is kind of mind-boggling. And there's a whole other sermon there for another time. For today, we're just putting that to one side. And where we land at the start of chapter 33 is that God has directed his people to continue, to go on up to the promised land. He's keeping that oath. But he says he will only send an angel to go before them. God is no longer planning to go with them himself because of further fallout from the golden calf incident. So then what we get is basically round 2 of Moses interceding for the people. I'll read from verse 12. It says, Moses said to the Lord, "You have been telling me, lead these people, but you've not let me know whom you will send with me. You have said, I know you by name, and you have found favor with me. If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people." The Lord replied, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Moses said to him, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" And the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you and I know you by name." Then Moses said, "Now show me your glory." And the Lord said, "I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But," he said, "you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." Then the Lord said, "There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen." It's an incredible story, and there is far more in that passage than we have time to unpack today, but I want to draw our attention to a couple of key things. First of all, this profound encounter that Moses has with God. I might be stating the obvious here, but it takes place in the wilderness. And I emphasize that because I think we can have this generalized view of desert seasons when we talk about wilderness experiences in faith. But do we realize that this is also one of them? Moses having this up-close personal revelation of the glory of God, that is part of his wilderness experience. So it begs the question, what marks the difference between Moses' wilderness experience of spiritual intimacy and the Israelites' wilderness experience where they feel abandoned by God? I would say the key difference is in how they are each responding to the presence of God. Now look, on the one hand, you might think this is an unfair comparison, right? After all, Moses is the set-apart leader. He gets all this privileged one-on-one time with God, so of course his wilderness experience is going to look different, right? Who can compete with that? I get that, sure. At the same time, don't forget what we saw before in chapter 24, that it was not just Moses, but also Aaron and his sons and 70 elders of Israel that had the privilege of seeing God. Remember, they saw God and they ate and drank. And even the rest of the Israelites, it tells us that they saw the glory of the Lord as a consuming fire on the mountaintop. It is not as though they had nothing to work with. They had still profoundly encountered the presence of God. The difference is their response. When Moses takes a long time coming down from the mountain and therefore God is no longer working in accordance with the Israelites' expectations, their response is to turn away. Even though they had previously experienced the presence of God, in that moment of perceived hardship, they turn away. They give up on him and they look to put their devotion somewhere else. But what about Moses? Because I would say that in this story, Moses also has an experience of God no longer working in accordance with his expectations. Like when God's anger burns against the Israelites and he says he's going to destroy them. Or when God says he will not go up with them to the promised land. I think it's safe to say that these would have been moments of hardship for Moses, don't you think? But how does Moses respond? Does he just turn away and give up on God? No. In fact, he does the opposite. He boldly presses in. He fervently seeks God, first interceding for the livelihood of the people, that God would spare them, and then interceding again that God's presence would go with them. And even after those prayers are answered, still Moses prays with even greater boldness, requesting to see God's glory. Moses presses in, and he does this because he understands the significance of the presence of God. We heard in verse 15, he said, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here." Moses knows that God's presence is life. God's presence is life. His presence is survival. It made me think of the words of Jesus in John 15. I am the vine, you are the branches. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Apart from God, we can do nothing. You see, we were made to dwell with God. Pastor Mark spoke into that last week. That was the original design, the Garden of Eden, before sin corrupted the world. We were made to be in God's presence. His presence is life. His presence is wholeness. It is the fullness of who we were created to be. So we need to press in to that, even in hardship, even when God feels absent, even in the wilderness. Now, of course, there's a key difference between us and the Israelites as we consider this application for our own lives. While Moses had to plead for God's presence to go with his people, today, as followers of Jesus under the new covenant, we now have the privilege of God's presence indwelling us through the Holy Spirit. God's presence is indwelling us through the Holy Spirit. It is an immense privilege. And it's one that we shouldn't take for granted. I think ours is a different prayer. We're not so much praying for God to be present because he already is. What we need to pray is that we ourselves would be present to him. Because honestly, I think that is one of the biggest barriers in today's culture. Not only are we here in Melbourne, just in a very secular culture, but it's also a world of smartphones and social media and 24/7 news. It's a culture of perpetual busyness where we're forever occupied and distracted, where we can have 17 different metaphorical browser tabs open in our minds at any one time. There is so much noise. And in that context, being present to God is unlikely to just happen incidentally. It is going to take discipline and intentionality. It was the 17th century Carmelite friar, Brother Lawrence, who wrote extensively about practicing the presence of God. And if you haven't come across that phrase before, maybe at first it sounds a little bit odd, but just to make it really clear, this is not about somehow manifesting or manufacturing God's presence through our own efforts. It's rather about cultivating and practicing a greater awareness of God's already existent presence in everyday life. Let me give you a recent example. During my annual leave in January, my husband Simon and I went to a gig at the Forum. Jesse was there too, Lucy was there too, it was a good time. One of my favourite bands was touring Australia for the very first time, and I was so excited to see them perform. And let me tell you, they did not disappoint. It was a top tier gig, it was just the best night. But to be clear, this was a very secular event. This was not a Christian band by any stretch of the imagination, and look, I love their songs, I love their music. At the same time, I cannot officially endorse 100% of their lyrical content, nor even some of the language they used in addressing the audience while they're on stage, just as full disclosure as your pastor so you know what sort of things I get up to during the week. Nevertheless, when we drove home from the gig, my husband shared with me how he had been praying during the concert. In the midst of all this secular entertainment and revelry, he was taking time out to give thanks to God for the gift of music, for the gift of creativity and joy. And this is quite an established practice for him. He's told me about it many times before as he's attended other gigs or all-day music festivals, all in highly, highly secular contexts. And I love that because it's just this small, everyday example of practicing the presence of God. Being more aware of God in both the ordinary and the extraordinary moments. I wonder how you are responding to the presence of God in your life at the moment. And I wonder what it might look like for you to more intentionally press in to God's presence. If you think back to your answers to those reflective questions at the start, those moments that you felt closer to God, Well, I would guess that there would be a wide range of diverse answers to that question in this room. I would also hazard a guess that the vast majority of those answers would share the one common thread, which is that we most tangibly experience the presence of God when we are posturing ourselves in a greater awareness of his presence. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. That is the promise of Scripture. And so I think that is why the wilderness, though it's so often associated as this place of hardship and trial, it can also be a place of beauty and spiritual intimacy, because it's where everything else is stripped away. It's just you and God. It's like that old saying, you may never know Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. The wilderness can offer us a profound opportunity to press in to God's presence. But it is up to us to make the most of that opportunity. It was a year or two ago now, I remember having a particularly difficult week of sermon writing, and I was just running out of time and was down to really one last day for it all to miraculously come together. And I remember praying, God, you really need to show up for me today. I'm running out of time. I'm on a deadline. Enough is enough. You got to give me the words. You need to come through. You've got to show up for me today. Have you ever just taken a tone with God? It was kind of one of those prayers. And almost immediately I sensed God responding to my prayer. And what I heard from God was, okay, but you need to show up too. You need to show up too. I couldn't just sit on the sidelines with my arms folded and just kind of wait for God to just hand me what I needed. I had to show up. All of me. I had to press in, to be present, to trust that he would meet me there, to trust that he is always working even in the unseen. Because our God is a God who moves towards us. He shows up. So we need to show up too. We need to draw near to him, because his presence is life. I'm going to invite the band to come forward now, and we're going to have an opportunity to respond in worship in song. I would say worshiping God is one of the best ways that we can posture ourselves towards him. And so I really want to encourage and challenge you tonight to press in, to be present. And maybe that needs to start with the Psalm 139 prayer of search me, God, and know my heart. Asking God to help you see the places where you are not yet fully present to him, to surrender them over to his grace. Can I also say, I think a part of being present is bringing all that we are and considering our physical posture as well. So I encourage you to stand, but also if you're feeling like you want to, maybe you want to kneel. And there's plenty of space down the front, in the back, in the aisles. I recognize it's a little awkward in the pews, but can I encourage you that 2 seconds of awkwardness of shuffling next to someone is worth it for an opportunity to intentionally posture yourselves towards our King. So can I invite you to stand now, to close your eyes, to help focus, rid your mind of distractions. I also encourage you to hold out your hands with open palms. It's just an outward symbol of an inner posture that is attentive and ready to receive. We just want to wait on the Lord. Lord, help us become more aware of your presence, because your presence is life. Apart from you, we can do nothing. As we draw near to you now, would you draw near to us? Convict our hearts, God. Help us to see the places that are not fully turned over to you. Help us to surrender them to your grace. Help us to be present to you spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally. Let us bring all that we are to you, God. Let us become more aware of your presence. Let us experience the glory of your goodness.
Of your presence, let us experience.